Imagine a vehicle that can drive you 5 miles for a penny. A vehicle that needs no petrol, just a battery. And that takes the press of a button to start, the squeeze of a lever to stop. That needs no license, no road tax, and you can drive whether you're 14 or 40. A vehicle that costs just £399. The Sinclair C5. It's a new power in personal transport.
After DeLorean, I was approached by an old friend called Tom Perran. Tom Perran was the guy who designed the Bond Bug and the Reliant three-wheeler and the Scimitar GTE. And he asked me if I'd like to meet a guy called Clive Sinclair. Well, you know, in those days, Clive Sinclair was being written about in the newspapers and on television and as a guru of everything in those days. So, yeah, I didn't resist the opportunity to meet him. And he asked me if I'd run his electric vehicle program. I said no, because I didn't believe in electric vehicles. C5 came out of an attempt by government to encourage the development of electric vehicles. Basically, I remember Clive coming back from having lunch with Margaret Thatcher, saying that she tipped him off about this new legislation to enable a small electric vehicle to be developed. And that's what he was going to pursue. Clive, well, in fact, it wasn't Clive. It's a guy called Tony Wood Rogers, who had worked with Clive for many, many years. And Tony came up with this idea of taking that legislation, came up with this three-wheel prototype. I remember Colin Spooner, who was the engineering director of Lotus, who was key to the DeLorean program. I invited him over to try it out on an airfield, old airfield, and we within an hour we wrecked it. But Tony convinced Clive it was the thing to do. I was not at all sure.
I guess I first met Clive Sinclair at the Royal College of Art. I was a student doing a postgraduate degree in industrial design on transport with a sort of engineering side to it. I'd entered a competition to design a milk float, and Clive sponsored it, and I won the competition. So that was the first meet. And then I was quite into electric vehicles at the time, so I was doing car design, but you know, I wanted to do something a bit different. So my major project was an electric delivery van. So I was into electric vehicles, and Clive was obviously very publicly into electric vehicles. So he came to my degree show. I was in the loo at the time, and I was told I'd just missed him. So I went chasing after him and found him and got him back. And anyway, he took me to his apartment the next day and offered me a job to be his first head of design at a new company he was setting up called Sinclair Vehicles.
I was only going to do it if you'd buy Lotus. That was the deal. Mm. I knew the deal could be done because Colin Chapman had died. Mm. The Chapman family wanted to get rid of it, and it was capable of being done, and the deal was done. Once it failed, the same deal was picked up by David Wickens, British Car Auctions, and he basically just, you know, stole the deal. Mm. Once the Lotus deal fell through, Clive was paying me particularly well in those days. I didn't feel it appropriate to have a fitty and resign or anything. I decided to take his money and get on with it.
I was due to start in September. Fast forward, coming down from Scotland, we thought we'd drop by Cambridge to see this crazy, infamous, superb meta lab where I'm supposed to be working. Anyway, the gates were chained shut at the Eastern Electricity Board. It was a bit of a wreck, so we went into town to Willis Road, where the headquarters was, and the receptionist went white and said, "Clive's been looking for you everywhere." Of course, I was up in the wilds of Scotland. And so I went to see him, and he showed me a picture. It was incredibly disappointing, of this strange grey, so it's a green three-wheeled object. Of course, I was expecting to design a real car, and it was just horrible. And Clive was looking at it. He was obviously concerned. He had good visual sense as a man, and he thought something wasn't quite right. And he was asking me if I could put some decals on it or change something. And I just had one of those moments of great clarity as a young 23-year-old. And I just said, "I'm really sorry, Clive, but you have to start again." And it was ridiculous, because he was worth 100 million, just been knighted, and I'm just a graduate. Totally crazy. But he just gave me the now famous Clive stare for a few seconds. And I think he could see that I was just genuinely, this was my view. And he respected that, which I think was hugely to his credit. And then he asked me, how long it would take me. And I picked a number because I didn't have a clue, and he halved it. And the next day I ended up in a taxi from my digs in Putney up to Lotus Cars in Hethel, where I met a bunch of guys in brown suits with DeLorean notepaper. And at the time, DeLorean was very much in the news, and I had one of those kind of uh-oh moments. What am I into here? But they were fine. They were lovely guys. We worked together very closely.
Well, Gus Deborah, his contribution was immense, because Peter Stevens had failed with his attempt, and despite his massive reputation, neither Clive nor I liked it.
And so at that meeting, we agreed what are known as the hard points. It turned out that the project was very advanced. In fact, it was at what in those days was known as pattern stage. So the shape had been realized for engineering, and they'd started the tool incredibly late. So it was an incredible shift to start again with the body tool, so there was no time for it in the schedule. I was critical path from the first day of my professional life. And we agreed we couldn't change the chassis, and the position of anything. But other than that, I could completely redo the body, which I did.
Gus's effort was inspired.
Literally, my job was to put lipstick on a pig, and I did a nice job with the lipstick, and I learned a lot in the process. So
he developed what is, without doubt, an iconic design. Regardless of whether the project succeeded or not, it's an iconic design.
There are, evolutionary psychology and things like that. We have expectations for things. That's how it works. Okay, that's what I do professionally. People see things, boom, it mirrors on their past experience. They like it, they don't like it. And there were bits of this that people were looking at, and they were going, "This is wrong."
The classic thing which Gus taught me is that what you can do with a bit of plastic. If you look at a C5 and you don't have the front wheel cover on, what you see is this puny little wheel sticking out from underneath this lovely body. It looks absolutely ridiculous.
That front end should be propped up by something. And so everybody would then go, oh yeah, look, it's propped up. It's better now. So that was absolutely, a great sort of lesson for me that I've applied in everything else I've done, really.
When you put this clip on, this moulding, suddenly you have this enormous, sturdy-looking front end. Means business. There could be anything inside there. It could be a motor. And that's a magic little move that Gus did.
It was funny how everybody just, although it was extra cost and complexity, everybody all of a sudden just said, that's what's been missing.
It was very much, this is what I want, Barrie, go and do it. And he gave me total freedom. I hired people I wanted. A couple I inherited.
When I went up to Lotus, the mechanical engineering team, the head of engineering was a guy called Brian Spooner, who was the older brother of Colin Spooner, who was the head of engineering. the project meetings had like Brian, me, and then the buyers and Barrie sitting at the head of the table, chasing us weekly for our project targets. So I never went to work for Sinclair Vehicles. I was a Sinclair research employee, consultant advisor to Sinclair Vehicles. Perran was the same. So we were based at the Meta Lab.
The other guy who made an immense contribution was Perran Newman, who did the electronics on the project. And that's all down to him.
My excitement, of course, having seen Barrie Wills and learning what the project was, but I'd been desperately trying to sell an electrically assisted bike development when I was at PA. Our cost structure was far too high for the industry to take that project. But here was one I could do, and I could play a key role in the areas which I thought I really knew a lot about.
Two admirable young men who made a tremendous contribution, both of them, to the vehicle development program.
There was Harvey's, and then there were all the other molders, and Clive, and that was very much. And then Perran obviously came on board.
I'd met Gus. I really liked Gus. I mean, his approach to it was superb, and he let me in on the background story of how he'd told Clive he's got to start again on some of it.
As Chris used to say, it was the first Sinclair product that ever launched on time. It was really well project managed. Barrie was a really good project manager.
The third guy was a guy I brought in called Peter Milner, who headed up the overseeing the engineering program at Lotus, where Brian Spooner, the brother of Colin Spooner, who I referred to earlier, was the key man in heading that up. It was a small team. Ken Evans was supporting Brian. As I say, it was a 2-3 man team at Lotus, but they engineered and developed and tested and proved and got it through legislation, the limited legislation that was required, but we also set additional legislation that was more based on car type principles, like the lighting. There was no legislation for lighting, but we adopted car lighting principles and made sure that the vehicle met them.
Because I think that's the other thing people forget is how small the team was. 6 of us brought that project 95% of the way to production. And then all of a sudden, as it got close to production, the number of people involved just grew exponentially.
When I first met Clive at Sinclair headquarters, when I had to go in to see him, Ian, his brother, having identified me 24 hours earlier, he didn't let on at all what the project was. He wanted to know about my electronics background, and I was able to tell him about the projects I'd worked on, which included a washing machine, funnily enough. But he didn't give any clue as to what the project might be. The interview probably lasted 10 minutes or so. But I did talk about the fact that I'd been involved with battery vehicles. I was a chairman of the Battery Vehicle Society. I'd organised races. I'd raced and built single-seater electric vehicles running from 2 car batteries. And I had in my hand I brought along a little booklet I produced, which is, we supplied to members of the group to learn how to build I call them electrolytes, lightweight electric vehicles. It had detailed plans for several of them. And I saw a smile on his face when he picked that up. I hope he read it. He didn't ever refer to it backwards, but I imagine he probably, when he went back, he reinforced in his mind, this must be the right guy. He's doing exactly what I want. But he didn't let on that. But the fact that I got an offer of a job the next day shows that he realised I was the right guy. And I knew I was. So I wasn't daunted at all. I thought, yes, I can bring to this project just what is needed.
But the best bit was that, for me personally, was that Clive insisted that designers remain involved with the project. So it was very much unlike the car business, where I'd sort of done some apprentice work at Saab and things like that before that, where you were very much in your ivory tower and nobody else was allowed in, and the engineers were the sort of grown-ups and you were just the guy doing the pretty pictures. And I could see I wouldn't be happy with that life. C5 was a chance to sort of take a car in quarter scale from sketch through to production.
Clive, because he was forever in the press in those days because he was knighted. He was he was going down to Downing Street for lunch with Margaret Thatcher twice a week. He was being consulted by all sorts of people who were doing television series, all sorts of things were going on. And he persisted in referring to his electric car program. I deliberately ensured that the company's name was Sinclair Vehicles Limited. That was a deliberate strategy on my part to try and get him away from the term car, but I failed completely. And as a result, Clive built up this expectation in the press.
I then started work in this shell of the Eastern Electricity Board that hadn't begun to be renovated yet. We had big gas outdoor heaters. It was getting a bit chilly, down in reception. And I was like Bob Cratchit. I had my sort of cardigan sweater and I was kitting out a studio. That was the cool bit. It was whatever I wanted, I got. There were about 4 or 5 concepts and Clive chose one.
In the beginning, it was just Gus and myself and the director of Metalab. But some of the best-known projects there were the Animatic, which is using, rather than cutting a chip up a silicon die up into lots of little chips and then sticking them in plastic packages.
I then went back to Lotus, where I then did a tape. Now, these were the classic automotive process in those days. And then started working on a full-size clay model in the pattern shop.
The project was full of secrecy. We guarded the product in its development program. Like, nobody was allowed to see it outside the participants.
We didn't have big meetings. What are you working on? No one knew what the C5 was.
So we evolved the clay, and then Clive would fly in on Fridays. The secrecy was ridiculous. Nobody else was allowed into the pattern shop. It was Lotus's top secret place.
Lotus did a great job. Lotus downplayed their involvement after things didn't work out. They couldn't get away from the fact that the backbone chassis was very much a Lotus thing, but they downplayed the fact that they had total responsibility for product development, tests, and proving. It was basically a Lotus vehicle.
Colin Spooner was the head of engineering at Lotus, and I would get into this large Ford Ghia limousine, and it was like something in a Fellini movie. We would drive out to the airfield, and Clive would come down the steps, and then we would go back, and the clay would be in the garage, the executive garage at Lotus, and Clive would view the clay and decide, pass judgment and things.
When we carried the prototypes up and down to the first floor of the Regency mansion, we had a big cover over them. I had a Sierra Estate, which would fit in, and we had a cover over that.
It was kind of my materials knowledge pretty much determined what we did. And then, of course, it had to be done. Anything else had to just be done in polypropylene, so because we were buying a lot of this stuff.
The polypropylene shell was a bit of a breakthrough. I mean, it wasn't unique. It followed technology that had been used with the Maestro.
From the cap on the battery to locks in the boot, using corrugated cardboard, Corex stuff for the boot liner. It was probably the most varied use of materials. Bearing in mind, I've worked on about 1,000 projects since then. It was fascinating in that regard.
You can't do a semi-serious car without serious capital. And therefore C5's, the idea was it was going to produce cash flow to fund the projects. But he needed about 15 million to safely get to that point.
That's one of the things I really respected about him. He used his own money. He raised 12.9 million.
Due to the Spectrum success, Sinclair was making massive profits. And I think Rothschilds came to him and said, look, we would like a slice of his action. Would you be prepared to sell us some shares? He sold 10% of the company for £15 million. And that was his own money because it was its own shares he was selling.
So the next phase was, okay, you've done the body. So right, we now need to look at other things. And safety was a big issue. And there was obviously an issue of rain. So I had to find a fashion designer from the Royal College of Art. And then we had to figure out how to seal someone because this was all kind of reverse engineering. This was not part of the concept. And also, we lined up this amazing guy from Lancashire called Eddie Craig, who was a sort of consultant on, ripstop nylon and, the stuff that you make backpacks out of and all of that stuff. He was a great guy to work with. So there's fascinating people. And we designed what became the skirts with the top, with the bib that attached. Most people wouldn't be caught dead in.
So we were very thorough. I don't think there was anything that we missed.
I mean, Gus wanted it when you picked up that charge of the weight distribution such that it didn't slip off your hand. He was so, in tune with these aspects of design.
The other, big issue was Clive. I asked him. He'd come in for his weekly reviews, and how are you going to know if you run out of fuel or juice? I was like, oh, yeah.
What I think is probably the cleverest bit of a C5, because the rest is just basic engineering, which is the fuel gauge. And again, a lot of people don't realise, they think that instrumentation up there is just a simple voltmeter that shows that battery's running out. No, it isn't. If you had a voltmeter there with the dots indicating the volts on the battery, as soon as you press the button start, the battery voltage would dive down because it's supplying very high currents, and your thing would drop down, and they think, oh, what's going on here? It has to be all smoothed out. The reason a battery gets weaker and weaker as you start using it is its resistance begins to rise. Some of the material on it is getting depleted and used. So as you draw current from it, it begins to droop more and more. And we're monitoring that droop, setting thresholds. And until it passed a particular threshold, we didn't move the display down. It was quite a clever thing to do, because you couldn't buy a battery condition gauge for lead acid. They were all voltmeters of some sort. So in a way, I took a real flyer on that. It turned out to work fairly well. I'm quite pleased with that, but I'm disappointed in a way people don't realise how sophisticated that bit is.
Once we focused on Oldham, again, tremendous enthusiasm on their part, and they ploughed everything into getting a deep discharge battery that would state of the art for its time. And I think there's no doubt that we'd got the best battery possible at that time of battery development.
Yeah. I was dealing with AB Electronics, who made the pod. I was very much involved in the design of the circuit board. When you've got something as tight as that, my knowledge of that was quite important. The control board was actually made by Hoover. So I was dealing with Hoover. Both these factories were in Wales. And what I would do was leave home at about 6 at night and hit Tewkesbury by late evening. Spend the night there, get an early breakfast, and then be over at Merthyr Tydfil, where Hoover factory was, for the morning meetings. And, I was doing that almost every week. I still had to get back to Cambridge to sort things out. We
did look at hybrid. I got to know a guy called Victor Wook very well, who was the guru of hybrid vehicles in those days. He was like a lone disciple of the hybrid vehicle. I think, again, we would have moved from the pure internal combustion engine vehicle into a hybrid, and then the next step, ultimately, electric.
I was having to put my money where my mouth is on some of these things. But I worked with some great guys at Hoover, and they had a pretty difficult task to bring it all together. But that was where the real pressure on the project was, working with the manufacturers and sorting out problems. The pod, which is where the signals go, the only signals coming up to the pod are obviously a voltage supply to drive it, a reading of what the current is, the status of what you've got on your whether you're asking the motor to run or not, and the temperature of the motor, which comes up to here as well. And the chip we used in there was a Ferranti ULA. ULAs are a way of tidying up lots of little bits and pieces of circuitry. And Sinclair had used ULAs. The most famous application is in the microdrive, the intelligent part of the microdrive. But he'd used them also in the Spectrum to tidy up lots of loose circuitry. So he said to me, I always wanted to use a microprocessor at that time. He said, no, I want you to use the ULA. We've got a very good arrangement with them, good deal. We understand it fully. And I see that only a couple of days after he told me that, Jim Westwood was, of course, really the brains behind a lot of Sinclair's. He was a very, very creative engineer, worked from Sinclair when he was 16 or 17 years old. He said to me, please don't use the Ferranti ULA. We're far too close to Ferranti. We know about all their issues and problems. We know them better than anyone else. There must be a better solution to that. I did not say to Jim, I don't have a choice. I'm not going to argue this one out with Clive. In many ways, by going for the ULA, the development of all the intelligent bit of the pod was then taken care of by Ferranti. And as this project grew in structure and size, and the problems became very obvious, and the tasks I had to undertake, if I was sitting doing microprocessor development as well, which I love doing, I would have been completely overstretched. And when I actually look at the files and open them, I still get a slight sweat, perspiration, because it brings back to me the pressure I was under.
I got on fine. There was never a problem at all.
There was a lot of gallows humour and a lot of worry.
Clive was never aggressive with me. I think he may have sussed out that I was quite an outspoken person in my own right. So whereas I would hear him tearing people to pieces through the wall when we were in adjacent offices in London.
And that was one of the weird things about Clive, was that, he's seen in retrospect as a computer entrepreneur, but actually he was more of a kind of general buffony type.
One of Clive's characteristics was he was a very generous man. And I've heard from other people, he didn't look back, he wasn't nostalgic, he didn't have an interest in what went before.
And it was really, who's he, Woodward? There were people around him who got him into computers effectively, and then he kind of went with it. So he was always hungry to, he had Mike Pye down in Winchester doing radio watches. He had some other guy doing a microlight up north. So he was, he's just always into different things like that.
The motor used in the C5 is a permanent magnet motor. It's the sort of motor you would find driving the cooling fan on a car. Modern cars contain hundreds of motors. If your seat adjustment, your mirror adjustment, all motors, they all use the same principle, permanent magnets and a simple armature. So there's nothing different about that. Polymotor did in fact make motors for torpedoes. So if the press had got hold of that, I think it would have a much nicer story. It was just this silly story because Hoover must be washing machines. So it's very easy to dismiss that. No way you could use a washing machine motor or any derivative of it to drive a C5. Kids were used to constantly drive C5s around a hill, bumpy tracks and so on. They went round and round. These were fiberglass prototypes, but they were testing out the motor, the chassis strength and so on. And you could, if you knew where you could stand with a telephoto lens, you could have photographed them. What we didn't want to do was have deep discharge on that battery because it would invalidate guarantees given by Oldham. So when we got down to, I think the threshold was 10.5 volts on load, that was the point at which we wanted to stop the vehicle going. And I realized you couldn't just stop it because the guy might be turning right at the traffic lights in front of a crowd of cars. But I wasn't feeling entirely comfortable. I'd covered things like deliberate stall. If you stall a C5, within 5 seconds it'll drop out. And you have to go through a procedure to get back to where it will work, turning everything off and turning on again. The next level of protection is looking at the slow rise in temperature on the motor, which occurs if you're doing lots of hill climbing and so on. What we did there was it was a suggestion, I think, from Polymotor. They said, we can drill a hole down the motor shaft. And I thought, well, if we can do that, we could poke something down that motor shaft and look at what the temperature is. We get a better approximation than any other way. Someone came up with a clever little clip. It clips on the back of the motor. And it's got a long metal tube, and inside that is the thermistor. So it's fully protected against rubbing, and any rubbing forces are taken by the tube. And that was a real breakthrough. We knew now we had a really good way of measuring motor temperatures, and we could do a whole series of tests. And that covered the situation, the motor getting slowly hotter and hotter because you're going up a hill, you're running in the red on the battery consumption meter, and the thing is getting hotter and hotter and eventually going to fail. And as a third line of defense, we put a thermal trip on the outer case of the motor, a bimetallic switch which would cut out. So I felt I'd covered it in all three areas. And I am proud to say that I never had, in the time that we were actively running and monitoring, we never had a motor failure. So that, to me, is probably the most successful thing I did on the C5 project.
The other side that I got to know really well was, and I think deserve a lot more mention, is the marketing side. A guy called Chris Fox, who did a lot of the marketing for Sinclair Research, had gone to work for Clive. He was on the board and had a falling out with one of the other directors about a price cut. And it was a sort of him or me thing. So he ended up staying as a non-exec, but he then became the marketing consultant on C5. And he was one of the founders of an agency called Primary Contact. So Primary Contact did all the marketing materials, which were really, really well executed. We were all worried about the viability of the thing because it was developed in such secrecy that it had never been near the road. It had never been anywhere near a real use. So he was just absolutely clambering to Clive, that it really needed to be market researched. And it did get market researched, and market research said it would sell in relatively small numbers, relatively to mainly to old people. And that wasn't popular, so there were orders to lock it in the safe forevermore. But his fears just grew and grew and grew, and everybody was quite stressed. It was quite a fraught sort of time, really.
My confidence grew because as we exposed the C5 to the various parties that became involved in it, particularly companies like Hoover, who came to us very enthusiastically wanting to build it. We didn't go to them, they came to us. They were so enthusiastic about what they were seeing, I couldn't believe it. I remember taking a prototype out to the USA to meet the main board of Hoover in the States. The chairman of Hoover hopped off, and off he went. He came back about 15 minutes later raving about it. And Lotus, again, were totally committed and enthusiastic about turning it into a success. It was infectious, really.
Again, the professionalism of the look changed things. They were really struggling to get people to sign up before the redesign. And afterwards, people, okay, it looks cool.
Victor Khayyam wanted it to sell in the retirement communities in America, which were big. They were all driving around on golf carts, and you could buy 3-4 C5s for a golf cart. And of course, we developed almost a golf cart version of it that he could have built out there. And the plan was he wanted to build it up in New England. Again, I got a deal lined up for Clive. All he had to do was sign a bit of paper. Victor wanted Clive on his board, and he asked him to put a little bit of money in, and Clive declined, and we didn't sign that day. And again, big missed opportunity. It struck me that if all these people were right, and they were so enthusiastic about the potential for success, we ought to think about building it in the States as well. I made an approach to Whirlpool, who are the biggest manufacturer of appliances, domestic appliances in the world, and took the same prototype to show them. And again, they went completely ape about it. They wanted it. They wanted to build a small plant in the States and build it for the American market. So we'd had Hoover building it for Europe and Whirlpool for the States. Yeah, great idea. Along came a guy from a spurious outfit called the British Safety Council, James Tighe. Never trust a man who wears a bow tie.
Barrie blames a lot of it on this guy, Tighe, I think, Mike Tighe. Yeah, who sort of had a kind of commercial thing that masqueraded as a British thing, and he sort of had it in for the project.
He was an expert at criticising the Queen for not wearing helmets when she was riding, letting her children ride horses without purely to promote his own business, which was selling pamphlets and training courses in safety. A dreadful man. But clever. He succeeded, we found.
It always amazes me that the press, who were very keen to find out, never did their homework. If you went to the Lotus site, from the road, you could see one of their test tracks.
A product that was developed on the flat with, frankly, sort of a dubious performance envelope at best. The engineering, there's some, stuff as a professional innovator, I can tell you with hindsight, the basic feasibility numbers weren't there. The basic experience wasn't there. The experience was you were low and exposed, and the performance parameters meant the range, you were loading things absolutely to an extreme. Batteries don't work as well when it's cold. And, urban traffic is probably one of the last places you would expect people to use a C5.
In typical, I think, Barrie Wills style, being from the automotive sector, he did some pretty comprehensive testing of the C5. And one of them took place at the Transport and Road Research Laboratory down in Berkshire. And this must have cost a lot of money, but we had a lot of pre-production C5s available. And we drove round in pretty cold conditions, actually, around simulated roads with heavy lorries, other cyclists, cars, and we were all had to answer a whole questionnaire at the end about our experiences, and the people who were driving the heavy lorries had to write down what they felt had gone on. And it was typical of Barry's approach, let's do things properly at every stage.
So I was one of the first people to get overtaken by a lorry in the rain on C5. And that was just like, okay.
I joined in October 83. We had to have everything sorted and start making pre-production prototypes by July 84.
But certainly less than 2 years from start to finish.
And then that was a long tail there where all the little I's had to be dotted, T's crossed.
Everything in my life seems to have been done in 2 years. The drawing was done in 28 months.
And as you know, the launch was in early 85.
The planning had gone well. We were ready to go.
Well, the launch was a classic of Clive putting his foot down.
Suddenly, Clive, knowing that we were ready to go, wanted to start getting some money back.
Cash flow became a really serious problem. The 15 million was running out. And that was a decision to launch then in February, was based on the fact that they couldn't have survived any longer.
He insisted that we launch at the earliest possible time.
And that was a terrible decision to have taken, because if they'd just taken things more easy during the development, kept the team smaller, got things sorted using key employees, the burn of money would have been far lower, and they could have then ramped up for a launch in the summer. It would have been a quite different scenario.
We organised what I thought was a very professional launch.
So, for various reasons, the product ended up getting launched at Alexandra Palace at the top of a hill in January in a snowstorm.
The location of the launch was something that I'd allowed, no complaints. It was delegation. The marketing people to choose. Well, the rest is history. We chose probably the worst winter day of the previous 10 years. And
on the day, I sat up in the stands watching the launch itself, where the C5s, their headlights switched on and they burst out of the kennels. It was a wonderfully dramatic opening.
There's no chance that for an electric vehicle to compete with ordinary vehicles unless it's mass-produced, because other vehicles are in very large-scale mass production. You've got to go into really heavy tooling, really large-scale mass production. You've got to design from scratch, really use the latest materials, really get the cost out, and that's what we've done. Scores
of journalists were there. I remember the first question being asked of me by a very young John Humphreys, who fortunately wasn't by then the tiger that he turned out to be on the Today programme. He was easy to handle. James Tye was there, sadly, and he managed to collar the British press too, for his own purposes.
Well, my opinion is the same as when I tested it at their works last week. Number one, the idea of 14-year-old kids taking these things on the roads like today, no licence, no insurance, no training, no seatbelt, no skid lid, no protection, frankly horrifies me.
And of course, everything went perfect. Nothing failed. The girls didn't roll one over.
And as much as we had planned that when we let the journalists loose on the vehicle, on the test track, the circular test track that had been built.
Technical press came to see me, and the serious technical press then were to write properly about all the protection systems in there and so on.
All the doors would be locked at Alexandra Palace, and none of them would get out. Well, they all got out. Yeah. They rode down to the bottom of the hill, and they tried to get back up the hill. And of course, the combination of bad weather, low temperature, not good for batteries, lead-acid batteries.
And there were many attempts to try and control it. And of course, the minute Stirling Moss jumped in one and went streaming off down the hill, I was like, okay.
I think I played an important role there because obviously people were getting one side of a story, but not the other. Some people didn't bother to come and see my display, but it was an important part of that.
Despite that, some of the more serious journalists were very complimentary. Probably the most significant of all was Stirling Moss.
Stirling Moss getting stuck at the bottom of Alexandra Palace Hill is not a good thing.
Basically, all he was saying was, don't regard this as a car. Treat it as the type of vehicle it is intended to be. Treat it with respect and, get on with it. His positive approach was totally overwhelmed by the negative press that set off within 48 hours of the launch at Alexandra Palace.
The press sort of pouring scorn on what was going on, really. When you have limited range, you have coal batteries and so on.
It had a lot of press that was totally unfair, like, the story about, you're sitting in a position in it where the exhaust pipe of a truck is sticking up. It's not. The seating position of a C5 is the same as a Ford Capri, right? It's just you haven't got a Ford Capri body around it.
The bottom line is that you are sitting exposed with a very low eye line on the road, which is not a good place to be.
Once the Brad press started, it went on and on and on. And there was one particular newspaper, I think it's the Express, where the editor told his correspondent he wanted a C5 story every day for a fortnight, and it became, the bad news just multiplied and multiplied.
I think if they thought about the ideal launch date and ramped up more slowly, none of us would be under so much pressure, and we could have got those little issues like the ones of belt slip, the tilting of the motor, and so on. Little things which could have been sorted at the pre-production stage.
Even the fact that Granny Giles had one in the Giles cartoon in the Express didn't help us much either.
So that really, that kind of brought it home, because the secrecy was the thing up until then. Nobody had a clue what it was. The world was like me 2 years previously, expecting a car. So the expectation management was very poor because of the secrecy.
I object to anybody that says it was unsafe. It was not unsafe. It was very safe because it met all legislation and more. But it was vulnerable.
Gus and I took out two C5s the day after the launch, and I rolled one in front of a crowd of people. And I picked it up pretty quickly, but I was showing off. And, it's so easy to roll one. You just flat out and turn the handlebars hard. And, I could have been torn off a strip for that. I think it was well covered up, but people saw that.
I watched other people get cold feet through. The Electricity Council ran a mile as the PR got worse. They really let us down because they got a C5 in every showroom, and they just pulled them.
Yeah, I can remember that being, just a really bleak time.
I took it very badly, and I felt I'd let down a lot of people. I felt I let down Clive.
I think after the launch, I think everybody had a view, but, I was 23 years old, and Clive's vision, Clive was worth 100 million, and he had just been knighted. So who was I to challenge his vision? I
wasn't much more than an observer of what was going on, but he was terribly distracted. Had a hell of a time. Yeah, a great shame.
No great surprise that when it arrived, people were asking all kinds of questions, because I think the thing that caught Clive out was computing was a new thing. So you can get away with being oversimplistic and not very good at the experience if something is new. Microsoft got away with that for years until Apple came along. But transportation is a mature thing. People have other choices. They have expectations of what transportation is like. And this just, let people down in a lot of ways.
I was under so much pressure. I think my brain was about to burst, and I took a month off.
And, that was a lesson I learned, basically, which is, doesn't matter who they are. If you don't think the experience is right, then you have to challenge it. And I've done very well professionally out of that.
I don't think it's a case of who got it wrong. I think it was a case of the concept being wrong. Because there's no doubt that with the benefit of hindsight, it didn't fit in naturally with other vehicles on the road. It was vulnerable.
I didn't feel vulnerable, but in a sense it was a slightly false situation because everyone was aware of what was going on.
The bottom line is that on a road, forget it. No, that the one I have has never been on the road.
I never used a C5 in a totally heavily crowded environment. I didn't drive one across London or anything like that. Cambridge is a city used to cycles, and using them there was no problem at all. So I don't fully understand the vulnerabilities.
And, there was a lot of good as well. It was, although the concept was fatally flawed. And so that really sucked me into thinking conceptually about things. But the execution of, the professionals involved, from Barrie to Chris Fox.
It was the development of batteries that was the factor that was really holding things back. The lead acid battery was never going to do it. And there had to be an alternative. If you placed electric vehicle development, well, it's happening, isn't it? It's taken an awful long time. And I think Clive missed an opportunity with Lotus and this little two-seater sports car, orthodox sports car, rear engine. Yeah. Yes, missed opportunity.
Probably Nat Cohen and the Sinclair research investors effectively, they were looking at the flotation and they were looking at the financing of Sinclair research, didn't really want Clive associated with anything as iffy as as the vehicle.
And then basically I came back and the time where it was a clean-up exercise. It was a case of salvaging as much as we could. Yeah, we put it to bed eventually, leaving a couple of off-highway vehicles in the USA.
It's a classic example of accidental innovation. Clive wanted to innovate with an electric vehicle that would play to his base of 14-year-olds. Okay. But because he was used to computing where there are no norms, he didn't understand that he inadvertently created an ergonomic innovation of a semi-reclining tricycle. And people didn't want that.
About 15,000 were made. About 9,000 were sold. And that probably includes those which were remaindered, because the $399 price, I think, came down to $199 through the big retailers like Comet and so on. And that shifted some more. 5,000 probably sold at the original price, maybe another 4 at the remaindered. And then all the stock was disposed of.
I did a deal with a guy from Liverpool. He was a guy specialised in buying redundant stock. And I sold the remaining vehicles and the parts to him. And he ran a successful business for several years, just drip feeding them out at premium prices around Christmas time. Clever guy.
I don't feel the need to apologize, to say, if only this or if only that. It was a classic example of a flawed concept.
The demise of his computer business occurred concurrent to the problems with C5.
C5 for me is not a bad news story.
People say, he was ahead of his time. If the C5 came out today, it would be a tremendous success. I'm not sure. Not so sure.
It was purely about semiotics and what looked right. And I think that is probably why it still appeals. It's just a futuristic looking thing that people, I think, kind of look at it and go, that's still cool.
And it's just a shame that the vehicle concept was not right for its time. Whether it's right for any time is another question, to be honest.
Funnily enough, until about 5 or 6 years ago, it was still a bit of a joke, and you can't shake that. You're even with, the teams that worked for me, if you wanted to take the piss out of the chairman, do his birthday card and put C5 in it, and that'll work.
God, if I took personally everything that in my 50-year career that went wrong, I wouldn't have lasted 50 years.
Yeah, C5 is a very special project for me. It was my first. And in many ways, I was incredibly lucky to have been given the opportunity to do it.
That's how I feel about it looking back. It's to be involved with a failure is absolutely marvellous.
Although it was a commercial disaster, there are so many anecdotes and innovation of learning from failure.
They say any fool can handle a success. It takes someone more than special to handle a failure.
Clive invested a huge amount so that I could have a ringside seat at a colossal business failure from all aspects. And it was incredibly informative.
I found that being associated with C5 has opened doors everywhere to me. It's a great conversation starter, icebreaker.
The recognition that my work impacted on the outside world is something that design just still doesn't, the individuals in it are not educated to think like leaders, and leaders, they are leaders, whether they like it or not, because their work controls the work of the engineers, everybody that comes after you. It's like being an architect.
I've absolutely zero regrets about being involved. It's one of the high points of my career.
So C5, in that sense, was my PhD.
Great experience, really was. I have a lot to thank Sinclair for.
And the lessons that I learned have inspired me ever since.
No, I look back and a feeling of pride and in having enjoyed the experience.
It was an icon of a really exciting time. I mean, the 80s, I know, there's the miners' strike and all of that, but that was not, my 80s was the Cambridge computing world. It was in the innovation world and the design world in London, in Holland Park after 85. And it was just a really great time for British entrepreneurship, and people tried stuff and did stuff and lots of cool things happened. It's just a shame that there was never the management expertise to grow these things. It just is timeless because it was never designed to be of a time. It was just designed objectively to be right visually, without any attempt to place it, to follow a style or copy.